Explicit content is found in this episode. Listener discretion is advised.
Welcome back to the True Crime Fan Club podcast. I'm your host, Lainey. I've always been fascinated by children who murder. What could possibly lead a youth to murder someone so viciously? And even worse, how could they turn on their own family? Join me as we explore these youthful offenders. Okay, on to the show. William and Opal Andrews were Baptist farmers who were anxious to welcome their youngest child into the world. In 1938, they welcomed a little girl named Jenny Marie Andrews. She was an outgoing and friendly 2-year-old and was the apple of her father's eye. Her mother enjoyed creating adorable dresses for her daughter to wear around town. When they welcomed their second and last child, Lowell Lee Andrews, on September 21, 1940, in Kansas City, Kansas, they felt that their family was now complete. Growing up, Lowell was the exact opposite of his sister. He was extremely shy and introverted, but he thrived in the church and was almost in a trance when listening to the hymnals and organ being played during Sunday service. He failed to shed his baby weight and was a robust young man. As soon as he learned to read, he was unstoppable. He was a frequent sight at the public library and would spend most of his days locked in his room reading. His mother worried that he might be lonely. He mingled with the youth in his local congregation, but failed to establish meaningful friendships. He learned about the bassoon and expressed interest to his parents on taking lessons, which they agreed to. It was yet another solitary hobby that would contribute to Lowell's private nature. His aptitude for music was exceptional, and he was very musically talented. In school, he excelled in math and science. He earned high marks despite his inability to engage with other students in his class. Despite his preference to spend time alone, he gave no indication that something dark was lurking inside. His teachers and other adults find him extremely polite. One woman, when later asked about his personality and demeanor, told the local newspaper that he was the nicest boy in Wolcott. When he graduated from high school, he told his parents that he would apply to the University of Kansas in Lawrence. It was only an hour away from his home, which made his parents very happy. His sister Jenny opted to attend Oklahoma State University, which was no surprise given her need for independence. When he entered into his freshman year, he opted to major in zoology and joined the orchestra. He was a large guy, standing over 6 feet and weighing in at 260 pounds. His mother was often worried about his weight holding him back, but he managed to get through his freshman year with high marks and was well liked by his orchestra peers. It was nearing the Thanksgiving break for many university students, including Jenny and Lowell. The pair returned to their home in Wolcott, Kansas to celebrate Thanksgiving with their parents. Their time spent together was relatively quiet, with Opal and Jenny spending much of the time preparing the meal in the kitchen. The aromas of ham, turkey, and the Thanksgiving pies filled the room. Lowell spent most of the time in his room reading his new copy of The Brothers Karamazov, written by Fyodor Dostoevsky. The book has many themes that center around spirituality and its place in common society, voluntary suffering, greed, and patricide, which is the act of killing one's father. On November 28, 1958, at around 7:00 p.m., Lowell concluded the book. He went into the family bathroom, showered, shaved, and put on his best Sunday suit. He grabbed a .22 caliber rifle and a German Luger pistol from his armoire. He stared at himself in the mirror, then proceeded to walk into the family room. He turned on a light which startled the family engrossed in a TV show. He aimed the rifle at his 20-year-old sister Jenny, who had no time to react. He shot her in between the eyes, killing her instantly. He then turned the gun on his father, William, who was now 50 years old. He shot his father twice with the rifle and quickly turned to Opal, age 41, and shot her 3 times. Opal was stunned from the shots, but she managed to get up and walk towards her son, likely begging him to stop. He pulled the Luger from his hip holster and shot her an additional 3 times. She immediately fell to the floor and died from her wounds. William, in an attempt to escape, crawled towards the kitchen. Following slowly behind his father, Lowell shot him repeatedly with the Luger. In total, William was shot 17 times and died in a pool of his own blood in the kitchen. Lowell recalled showing no emotion and admitted nothing had happened to prompt the murders. He just got it in his head to do it, and so he did. He was cognizant enough to know that he wanted to get away with the murders. He opened the windows in the main room, removed the screens, and knocked furniture around and threw the contents of the purses that his mother and sister had on the floor. All of this was to make it look like the family had been murdered by fictitious robbers. On his way to the movie theater to establish an alibi, he dismantled the guns and stopped on a bridge that overlooked the Kansas River and threw the dismantled pieces of metal into the water below. He arrived at the theater, and the normally introverted Lowell spoke rapidly to the ticket attendant and concessions cashier. He opted to watch the 1958 film Mardi Gras starring Pat Boone. He drove to his rooming house where he stayed during college to collect his typewriter. He also spoke to his roommate and landlady. He then went to a gas station and spoke to the attendant at length. This was all calculated on Lowell's part. As you recall, he's attempting to establish an airtight alibi. He returned to the home, fed the family dog, and then called police at 1 a.m. to report what he had found. Police arrived within minutes after his call and found Lowell outside on the front lawn playing fetch with his dog. When he saw that police had arrived, Lowell sat on the porch and petted his dog until authorities approached him. They asked him what happened, and he flatly pointed towards the front door and said, "Look in there." The deputies immediately noticed that he seemed unaffected by the bloody scene. They informed him that they were going to take him to the police station to do some tests. He admitted that he had shot his rifle earlier that afternoon, intending to kill a hawk that was causing trouble on the property. Placed in an interrogation room, Lowell expressed no interest in planning the funerals for his slain family, telling the deputy assigned to watch over him, "I don't care what you do with them." He instead gave the name of Reverend V.C. Dameron, who could help. When the Reverend arrived, he delivered his condolences to Lowell and prayed with him. He got up and retrieved a soda for Lowell. When he returned, he sat down and released a loud sigh. He asked Lowell if he had anything to do with what happened to his family. Something in Lowell must have been triggered because he immediately confessed to the minister. He then matter-of-factly said, "I'm not sorry, and I'm not glad I did it. I just don't know why I did it." Authorities were later informed by the Reverend that the murders were likely prompted by Lowell's desire to inherit his family's 210-acre farm and $1,800 in his father's savings account, which is roughly equal to $15,000 today. He thought of murdering his family since July of 1958 and considered different avenues to murder them, but they all seemed too risky. Reverend Dameron urged Lowell to confess to the police. Lowell agreed and told them about the murders and disclosed where he discarded the murder weapons. Police were only able to recover parts of the guns. During his trial, his defense entered a plea of not guilty by reason of insanity. He was charged with 3 counts of first-degree murder, which made him eligible for the death penalty. His defense team opted to not contest his confession. On February 20th, 1959, a court appointed 3 psychiatrists from the Menninger Clinic in Topeka to evaluate Lowell. They found that he had schizophrenia but did not experience delusions, thus legal insanity could not be established in this case. On January 18, 1960, a jury of his peers found him guilty, and he was sentenced to die. He appealed his sentence on the grounds that he was legally insane, that the Reverend should not have been permitted to testify since Lowell was a member of his church and he was bound by clergy confidentiality, and that the judge failed to instruct the jury correctly. On December 10, 1960, the Supreme Court of Kansas affirmed his conviction. Lowell then submitted a motion for a rehearing, which was denied in January of 1961. His time on death row was closing in, and he tried one last time to save his life. He sent an application to Kansas Governor John Anderson, Jr., in the hopes that he would commute his sentence, but in March of 1961, it was denied. The United States Supreme Court also denied his appeals. He was then sent to Lansing State Prison's death row. While on death row, he met 2 other famous murderers, Dick Hickok and Perry Smith, who were the subjects of Truman Capote's infamous true crime book, In Cold Blood. Dick Hickok shared his thoughts on Lowell with Truman Capote and said that Lowell had no respect for human life, including his own. Many who had witnessed his demeanor since the day of the slayings would share the same observations. On November 29, 1962, Lowell Lee Anderson, now aged 22, was preparing for his last day on Earth. He requested a final meal of 2 fried chickens, mashed potatoes, green beans, and pie a la mode. He ate it all alone in his cell, staying rather quiet that day. He was to be hanged by the neck until dead. When he approached the gallows, the warden asked him if he had any last words or requests. He did not. He was one of the last inmates to be executed in Kansas. He was pronounced dead on November 30th, 1962, at 12:01 a.m. Before we begin the next story, I would like for you to hear a word from our sponsors. Three decades after Lowell Lee Anderson murdered his family, another family would lose their lives over something seemingly innocuous. David Braum was born on October 3, 1971, to Bernard and Paulette Braum in Rochester, Minnesota. The second oldest of 4 children, he grew up in a well-to-do and well-adjusted household, according to most reports. The Braum family was devoutly Catholic and encouraged their children to build on their faith by enrolling them in private Catholic schools. In 1988, David attended Lourdes Roman Catholic High School. He was an exceptional student who had an aptitude for poetry and writing. Despite being a well-behaved child in his younger years, when David entered his teens, he became rebellious. In the late 1980s, heavy metal music was the epitome of rebellion. Bernard Braum did not find this type of music acceptable for his son. He saw David as a punk who would lose his way if he continued to listen to this music. The two often bickered over his behavior and musical choices. David hated oppression. He was expressive and needed an outlet to express how he was feeling. He became so frustrated with his father's nagging that he often told friends that he wanted to kill him. It was clear that Bernard, an employee at Rochester plant of International Business Machines, or IBM, was only interested in ensuring his son was walking the correct path. A recent cassette tape David purchased frustrated and concerned him. The death metal and talk of Satan in the lyrics were not welcomed in his home. On February 17, 1988, David was on the phone with a classmate when he stated matter-of-factly that he was going to kill his father. The classmate brushed off the comment as something teenagers say. After all, is there a person who can say they have never jokingly said they could or would kill someone? I know that I'm guilty of that, but I know there was no malintent on my end. That was not the case for David. He went to school the next day and again made the same comment to another friend. They had no way of knowing that he would commit one of the most heinous and brutal crimes in Rochester history. On the evening of February 18, 1988, David and Bernard began to argue yet again over the cassette tape. The argument was heated and both parties separated due to the escalating tension. It was around 11:30 p.m. and David returned to his room, completely enraged. He paced around contemplating his next steps. The family eventually went to bed, and David made his way to the garage, where he retrieved an axe, and made his way into his parents' room. Without much thought, he raised the axe above his head and slammed it down with brute force on his father's head. His father was stunned with the first blow, but attempted to get up. David continued hitting him until he finally stopped trying to get up. Awoken by the commotion, 40-year-old Diane attempted to escape, but David swung at her, fatally injuring her. She made it to the top of the steps before she collapsed. He then went to his 9-year-old brother Ricky's room and was shocked to hear a scream come from his brother before he even hit him. David hacked at his brother, screaming with each blow. 9-year-old Ricky put himself into a fetal position in an attempt to protect himself. Diane Braum, David's 14-year-old sister, was leaning over her mother in an attempt to help her when she was attacked by her brother. She was unable to escape the frenzied blows to her body. Soon, the only surviving members of the Braum family would be David and his older brother Joe, who was not home at the time of the attack. He was left bloodied from head to toe after the attack. He took a shower, shaved his head into a mohawk, and dyed it a different color. He knew he needed to go to school later that morning in order not to draw suspicion to the gruesome scene outside of his bedroom door. He readied himself for school and stepped over the bodies of his sister and mother on his way out. When he arrived to school, he couldn't contain his excitement. He shared with several friends that he had killed his family. He told one friend in detail what he did, which was later revealed in her witness testimony. She said David confessed to hitting his father with an axe and kept hitting him to stop him from getting up. He said it was disgusting and that someone had to be really sick to do something like that. The grapevine at the high school was abuzz with the rumor circulating around about David. David left school at the end of the day and made his way to the concrete plant to hide out in a culvert. School officials contacted the sheriff's office and reported their concerns. When 2 officers arrived around 5:30 p.m. that evening after the murders, they announced their presence. There was no response. They knocked again and entered. They searched the first floor, finding nothing. When they climbed the stairs to the second story, they were greeted by the bloodied and mutilated body of Diane and Paulette Brom. They called into dispatch to inform them that they had 2 fatalities. Several minutes later, they would update dispatch that 2 additional fatalities had been discovered. An urgent bolo was placed for David Brom after contact with 19-year-old Joe was established. Residents in the quiet town were on high alert, searching for the blue van often driven by David, but he was still hidden in the culvert until the next morning. He made his way to a local payphone that was inside of the post office and was spotted by a passerby who gave an updated description of David. He was quickly found and apprehended without incident. They noted that he was nervous and scared, but he remained quiet on the ride to the police station. After being interrogated, David did not offer any information as to why he committed the 4 murders. He was 16 years old, which created quite a predicament for the court system. Initially, he was charged as a juvenile offender. The following day, he was arraigned. Gone was the nervous and scared 16-year-old, and in his place was a calm and seemingly at peace David. He was formally charged with 4 counts of first-degree murder and 8 counts of second-degree murder. He entered a plea of not guilty and was ordered to undergo a psychiatric evaluation. The state prosecutor filed a motion to charge him as an adult, which was approved by Judge Ancy Morse. David pled not guilty by reason of mental illness. In order to determine if David was competent to stand trial and to determine if a mental illness excused his ability to understand right from wrong, the McNaughton rules were reviewed against his psychiatric evaluation. The McNaughton rules, which were adopted by the United States judicial system in 1851, state in part that there is a presumption that the defendant is sane and is responsible for any and all criminal acts they perpetrate. However, at the time of the crime, if the defendant suffered from a disease of the mind and did not understand right from wrong, then they can be declared not guilty due to insanity. David did not meet the standards of the McNaughton rules and therefore was found guilty and sentenced to 3 consecutive life sentences. Judge Ancy Morse, who oversaw the proceedings, disagreed with the sentencing guidelines and felt that David should have been sentenced to a mental institution to receive treatment for his mental illness. While in jail, David attempted suicide multiple times. Dr. Carl Malmquist, the psychiatrist assigned to evaluate David, said that he suffered from progressive depression that worsened over time. David Brom is currently housed at the Minnesota Correctional Facility, Stillwater, in Bayport, Minnesota. He will be eligible for parole in 2041, when he is 70 years old. Joe Brom went on to be a professor of philosophy and passed away from cancer in 2016. 30 years after the murders, a local radio station released a mini-documentary detailing their experience covering the Brom family murders. I'll share a clip with you now and link the full video in the show notes.
And really, we don't know exactly why David did what he did, because he's never talked to us or in a public format. So, only what we can talk about is what we know from what we saw of evidence that day 30 years ago and through the trials that occurred, the 2 different hearings and trials that went on. there was some difficult stuff going on in that family that, and with David himself and trying to deal with issues and questions, concerns that he had, and feeling that his parents were potentially overbearing or whatever. He didn't agree with their rules and such. So, we don't know that for sure.
The day the verdict came in, it was a Sunday, and I'll never forget because the Vikings had just picked up Herschel Walker that year, and they were playing, I think it was his first game, and so all these reporters and news producers are outside the courtroom waiting for the verdict to come in and somebody to come out and tell them what had happened. And they're all watching the Vikings game on their monitors. And I'd gone in to get the verdict, and we were told, reporters were told, you have to sit in this courtroom. You cannot leave until that jury is gone. We don't want you trying to get in touch with them. And we're upset because we're like, well, we want to get the news out. We don't want to sit here for 30 minutes. So Andy Brownell and I came up with this idea that I said, what I will do, even if I get in trouble, I will stand up, because that courtroom in the old courthouse had windows. So I told Andy I will stand up and show my my notepad. If you see that, that means he was convicted. So sure enough, they come in with a verdict. As the jury's leaving, I stand up, even at risk of getting in trouble. And I held the notebook up, and Andy was down outside and saw that, and gets on his phone, a mobile phone I think we had back then. And he's reporting this back to the station live on the air. And all these other reporters are, where did he get that? How did he get that?
On the morning of October 16th, 1989, David Brom was found guilty of first-degree murder charges for the slayings of his father, mother, and 2 younger siblings. He was ordered to serve 3 consecutive life sentences.
While Lowell Andrews and David Brom murdered their family in cold blood, there are stark differences to their demeanor and punishment. Lowell Andrews had no remorse for the slayings of his family and was hanged for his crimes. David Brom demonstrated anger issues and rebellious behavior that led him to murder his 4 family members. David's motive is still unclear, as he has never spoken publicly or offered any true explanation for the murders. He did show some emotion when he was detained for the murders, unlike Lowell. David's depression was also taken into consideration, while Lowell, despite suffering from schizophrenia, was dismissed. So I turn it over to you, listeners. What do you think? Do you think that Lowell should have been sentenced to die based on his diagnosis of schizophrenia? What do you think led David to murder his family in such a vicious way? Share your thoughts with me in the Facebook discussion group. Just search for True Crime Fan Club. Okay, fan club members, as I conclude this episode, my one question to you is, how will you sleep tonight? Thank you for listening. If you enjoyed this episode, please be sure to leave us a positive review on Apple Podcast or your podcast player of choice. You can find us on most social media platforms, Twitter @TCFCPod, Facebook.com/TCFCPodcast. You can also find us on Instagram, TCFC_podcast. And of course, our website is TrueCrimeFanClub.com. If you have an episode request, send us an email, tcfcpod@gmail.com. Music for the show was provided by We Talk of Dreams, who created custom music just for us. Check him out on Twitter @WeTalkOfDreams or WeTalkOfDreams.com. Audio engineering was provided by Ches, who manages Ches Gray Music. Research and content editing for the show was provided by Brittany Martinez. We would like to welcome to the club our most recent Patreon supporter, Michelle H.